The Walt Disney Company is one of the most powerful cultural forces ever created. It is not just a film studio or a theme park operator or a streaming platform. It is something much more layered, a system that spans movies, merchandise, media networks, physical experiences, and now digital ecosystems. At any given moment, millions of people around the world are interacting with Disney in some form, whether they realize it or not. Children grow up watching its characters. Families travel across continents to visit its parks, and entire industries now operate in the shadow of its influence. But Disney did not begin as a global empire. It began as a fragile idea built by a man who had already failed more than once, in an industry that most people didn't even take seriously. To understand how Disney became what it is today, you have to go back to a time when animation was not considered an art form, when films were short, experimental, and often disposable, and when the idea of building an entire company around cartoons would have sounded, at best, unrealistic. In the early 1920s, Walt Disney was not a success story. His first major attempt at building a studio, Laugh-O-Gram, collapsed under financial pressure. He struggled to pay employees, ran out of funding, and eventually had to shut everything down. By most definitions, he had already failed. With little money and even less stability, Disney moved to Hollywood. Not because he had a clear plan, but because he had run out of options elsewhere. At the time, Hollywood was rapidly becoming the center of the film industry, but animation was still a niche within it. Most studios focused on live-action productions, and cartoons were often treated as filler content rather than serious entertainment. It was in this uncertain environment that Disney began again. One of his early breakthroughs came with a character named Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. For a brief period, Oswald gave Disney a foothold in the industry and a sense that things might finally be working. But that success was short-lived. Due to a contractual arrangement with distributors, Disney did not actually own the rights to the character. When negotiations broke down, he lost Oswald, along with much of his team, almost overnight. For many creators, that would have been the end of the story. Instead, it became the turning point. On a train ride back to California, Disney began sketching ideas for a new character. That character would eventually become Mickey Mouse. Mickey was not just a replacement. He was a reset, a chance to build something entirely owned and controlled by Disney himself. But even with a new character, success was far from guaranteed. The animation industry was crowded with competitors, and audiences were not yet deeply invested in cartoon characters. What changed everything was timing and innovation. In 1928, Disney released Steamboat Willie, one of the first cartoons to successfully synchronize sound with animation. While sound technology already existed, integrating it seamlessly into animation created a new kind of experience. Suddenly, cartoons were not just visual gags. They had rhythm, personality, and energy. Audiences noticed. Steamboat Willie was a breakthrough, and Mickey Mouse quickly became a recognizable figure. But Disney did not stop at simply creating popular characters. From the beginning, there was a broader ambition to push animation beyond its existing limits and to elevate it into something more meaningful. That ambition led to one of the most significant gambles in entertainment history. In the mid-1930s, Disney decided to produce the first full-length animated feature film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. At the time, the idea was widely mocked within the industry. Critics referred to it as Disney's folly, arguing that no audience would sit through a feature-length cartoon and that the financial risk was far too great. The production itself was enormously expensive and technically demanding. Disney pushed his team to develop new animation techniques, improve storytelling, and create emotional depth in a medium that had rarely been taken seriously. When the film was released in 1937, it defied expectations. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs became a massive commercial success and received critical acclaim. More importantly, it fundamentally changed how animation was perceived. It proved that animated films could carry complex narratives, evoke genuine emotion, and compete with live-action cinema. This was not just a successful film. It It was the foundation of an industry. Following that success, Disney expanded rapidly, producing a series of films that would go on to define generations, including Cinderella, Peter Pan, and Sleeping Beauty. Each film reinforced the idea that Disney was not simply making content. It was building a recognizable style, a brand, and a relationship with its audience. But Walt Disney's ambitions extended beyond film. He began to envision a place where people could physically experience the worlds he had created on screen. At the time, amusement parks existed, but they were often poorly maintained and lacked cohesion. Disney believed he could do something different, something more immersive, more controlled, and more aligned with storytelling. In 1955, that vision became reality with the opening of Disneyland. Disneyland was not just a collection of rides. It was a carefully designed environment where every detail contributed to a larger narrative. Visitors were not just customers. They were participants in a curated experience. Cleanliness, organization, and thematic consistency became central to the park's identity, setting it apart from competitors. The success of Disneyland demonstrated something critical. Disney had discovered how to extend its intellectual property beyond the screen. This marked the beginning of a broader strategy, one that would eventually define the company. Films would introduce characters and stories. Merchandise would extend their presence into everyday life. Theme parks would transform them into physical experiences. Each element reinforced the others, creating a system that was far more powerful than any single product. However, the company faced a significant challenge in 1966 with the death of Walt Disney. Without its founder, Disney entered a period of uncertainty. While the company continued to operate, it lacked the clear creative direction that Walt had provided. Films during this period achieved mixed success, and the company struggled to maintain the same level of innovation. For a time, it seemed possible that Disney might become just another legacy studio, respected but no longer dominant. That changed in the late 1980s and early 1990s during what is often referred to as the Disney Renaissance. With films such as The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and The Lion King, the company regained its creative momentum. But this period was not just about successful films. It was about a shift in strategy. Disney began to think in terms of franchises rather than standalone projects. Characters and stories were no longer confined to a single film. They became assets that could be developed, expanded, and monetized across multiple platforms. This shift became even more pronounced in the 2000s and 2010s, when Disney pursued a series of major acquisitions. The purchase of Pixar brought cutting-edge animation technology and storytelling expertise. The acquisition of Marvel Studios provided access to a vast library of characters and narratives that could be developed into a cinematic universe. The acquisition of Lucasfilm added one of the most recognizable franchises in history. Finally, the acquisition of 21st Century Fox expanded Disney's content library even further. These moves were not random. They were part of a larger strategy to dominate intellectual property. By acquiring established franchises, Disney reduced the risk associated with creating entirely new content while simultaneously expanding its influence across multiple segments of the entertainment industry. The launch of Disney Plus represented another critical step. As media consumption shifted toward digital platforms, Disney moved to control not just the creation of content, but also its distribution. Streaming allowed the company to build a direct relationship with consumers, collect data, and integrate its various assets into a unified ecosystem. At this point, Disney's model becomes clear. It is not simply a content producer. It is an ecosystem builder. A single film can lead to merchandise, theme park attractions, spin-offs, and streaming content. Each component reinforces the others, creating a cycle that generates both revenue and long-term brand loyalty. And perhaps most importantly, Disney operates on something that is difficult to quantify, but incredibly powerful: nostalgia. Unlike many companies that must constantly fight for attention, Disney benefits from emotional connections that span generations. Parents who grew up watching Disney films introduce them to their children, creating a continuous cycle of engagement that few competitors can replicate. Of course, this level of dominance does not come without challenges. The media landscape is becoming increasingly fragmented. Streaming platforms are competing aggressively for attention. Audience preferences are evolving, and not every release achieves the level of success Disney expects. But despite these challenges, the company's core advantage remains intact. It owns stories that people care about, and in an economy driven by attention, that may be the most valuable asset of all. From a failed animation studio to a global empire, Disney's rise is not just a story about entertainment. It is a story about control over content, distribution, experience, and ultimately emotion. Because at its core, Disney did not just build a business. It built a system that turns stories into assets into ecosystems, and ecosystems into power. And that is why it continues to dominate. From cartoons to kingdoms, Disney proves that the real business isn't just what people watch. It's what they feel, remember, and keep coming back to. If you want more breakdowns on how companies build power, shape culture, and quietly dominate entire industries, subscribe to the Wealth Archives. I'll see you in the next one.